I held 9 days of meal under my pencil, and the cold already counting faster than I could. The well rope snapped clean, and the bucket dropped into darkness like it meant to stay there. I carved a new snow mark on the doorframe, then watched my boy's lips split as the kettle took more wood than we had. Outside, the town's laughter and the bank's paper felt lighter than a cup of water. And still, they pressed on my door. December 1865. Dakota Territory, a few miles east of a little bend folks called Ash Hollow. Snow sat thin on the grass, but the wind cut clean through it. Our cabin was a 2-room box of pinnut and clay chinking, tucked behind a low rise. I kept a stove going on cottonwood and whatever deadfall I could drag. My name is Caroline Webb, 60 years old that winter. The boy with me was Nate, 11, long-legged and too quiet when cold got him. I was his keeper, his cook, his sawyer, his nurse, and the one who said no when fear tried to speak for us. We had 9 days of meal and beans by my pencil, and wood for maybe 4 if the wind stayed sharp. If our water failed, thirst and frost would take the boy first, and I could not haul him to town. That first week, I still marked the doorframe, a knife nick at 3 inches of new snow. I wrote it beside a line in my ration ledger. December 3. Flour half sack, beans 2 cups. The well was 10 steps from the back stoop, boarded at the rim to keep leaves out. Its rope was hemp, thick as my thumb, knotted through a bucket handle I'd mended twice. Nate's mother had gone west the summer before, chasing talk of wages at a rail camp. No letter came back. His father, my son, had been taken by a fever the year prior, quick as a candle blown. So the boy's hands were in mine, and my hands were all we had. On the morning the trouble began, it was before dawn. The stove had died to coals, and the room smelled of yesterday's ash. I struck the flint, lit the oil lamp, and listened to the wind worry the eaves. Nate slept on the trundle near the warm bricks, his breath small and steady. I pulled on my boots and stepped out with the tin dipper. The cold made the boards speak under my feet. At the well, I set my palm on the rim to steady myself and fed the rope down. The bucket went easy at first. Then it caught, like a hook on a stone. I gave a gentle tug. The rope answered with a sound I felt in my bones. It snapped, not a slow give, a clean, hateful pop. The loose end whipped my wrist, and the rest slid down into darkness. I leaned over and saw nothing but a black mouth and a faint echo of the bucket striking water. Once, then gone. I stood there with my hand still open. Frost ran up my sleeve where the rope had kissed me. The frayed end hung in my fingers, knotted around a broken bucket handle, the fibers white as hair. That was my first signal, plain as a cracked plate on a table. Nate came to the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Grandma?" he said, and his voice sounded thirsty already. I did not answer quick. A woman learns to count her breath before she speaks. "Rope's gone," I told him. "Bucket, too." I held up the frayed hemp so he could see the truth. He stepped closer, and I saw his lips had begun to peel just at the corners. He had not complained once. That is what frightened me. Inside, as I warmed the stove until the iron hummed, I set the kettle on, more out of habit than hope, and stared at the empty dipper. The creek lay half a mile down the draw, under willows, shallow, but running under ice. We had used it in early fall, when the well was muddy. Now it was a white sheet, with dark seams. By first light, I had made my choice. I would not go down into that well mouth with a pole and prayers. If I slipped, there'd be no one to pull me out. And if I sent Nate, I would be sending his small hands into a thing that could swallow him. "Stay near the stove," I told him. "Keep the lamp trimmed." I handed him my patch record, a scrap of paper where I counted stitches on his coat elbow. "Mark it if the thread breaks," I said, just to give him work that felt steady. I took the axe, the spade, and an old barrel hoop. On the shelf, I found a clean strip of muslin we had saved from a flour sack, tagged in ink. H. Larkin Store. 50 pounds. I folded it, tucked it under my coat, and went out again. The wind was up, but the sky held clear. Snow squeaked under my boots like dry corn. Down in the draw, the creek spoke soft beneath its lid. I knelt and tested the ice with the axe butt. It was thick enough to bear a careful weight, but not thick enough to trust. At 7:10, by the little travel clock that hung crooked on the wall at home, I set my first cut. I struck with the axe blade flat, not to shatter, but to score. The sound traveled, and I half expected a wolf to answer. Only the creek answered, a slow, patient gurgle. I cut blocks the size of bread loaves, set them on the bank, and covered them with brush to slow their melting in the sun. When my fingers burned through the mittens, every few minutes I flexed them hard, as if anger could push blood back in. When I carried the first load home, Nate was sitting close to the stove, watching the kettle like it might fill itself. I set the ice in the washpan. Water ran off it like clear tears. "We'll melt it," I said. "Small batches." I did not say what I was thinking. that melting ice would take wood we could not spare. That midday, I wrote another line in the ledger. December 4th. Rope snapped. Water by ice. I underlined it. Proof for my own eyes, so panic could not pretend it hadn't happened. The first night was the hardest. After dusk, the stove wanted more than I could give it. The kettle hissed, and the room steamed for a moment, then chilled again, and I set the melted water in a stone jug and wrapped it in a blanket near the hearth. Still, by after midnight, a skin formed over the top. Nate woke, coughing. Not deep. Just enough to tell me his throat was dry. I sat him up, broke the ice skin with a spoon, and held the cup to his mouth. Slow, I said. If you drink fast, you'll vomit, and then we lose it twice. He obeyed. His eyes stayed on mine, as if my face was a map he needed. I kept my voice even. I kept my hands steady. Inside, I was counting days like beads. In the morning, I walked to Ash Hollow. It was 9 miles, and I left before first light, with the moon still showing. Nate stayed behind, with the door barred and the rifle out of his reach, but within my sight when I returned. The road was a rut of frozen mud with snow drifted in. At 3:40, I paused at the fence line and looked back. Smoke from our chimney was thin. That meant the fire was small. That meant the boy was trying to save wood, like I'd taught him. In town, H. Larkin's store smelled of coffee and harness oil. Mr. Larkin stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled, pen tucked in his vest. He looked me over like he was measuring boards. Caroline Webb, he said, as if my name was a debt. You payin' that flour yet? I brought a trade chit, I answered. From my pocket, I pulled a scrap signed last fall. 1 cord, split, cottonwood, credit $1.20. He had given it to me when I helped stack his winter pile. He squinted at it. Ain't much, he said. Rope costs. Bucket costs. Barrel costs. Then he smiled in a way that did not warm. Rope lay there, new hemp, coiled neat, and on the shelf sat a tin bucket with a hard handle. But he also had a price that would take my last coin, and then some. I can pay you in labor, I said. Sacks can be mended. Wood can be split and stacked. He leaned forward. Women don't haul like men, he said. You'll quit half done. He said it loud enough that 2 men by the stove laughed into their coffee. I did not laugh. No shout came out of me. Instead, I set my hand on the counter, flat. My boy needs water, I said. That rope snapped clean. I showed him the frayed end, the knot still tied through the broken handle. Proof in my palm. "Sell me what keeps him breathing," I said, "and you'll get your due." He clicked his tongue. "Credit's tight," he said. "Bank man wants paper." He nodded toward the window, where a fellow in a fine coat stood talking to the sheriff. I understood then. It wasn't only rope. It was power. And who was allowed to have it? I bought a short length of rope anyway. Not enough to reach the well water, just enough to lash and haul. I bought nails and one small keg of kerosene, because the lamp was life when dark came early. For the rest, I traded my best quilt, the one my daughter stitched before she vanished into the west. As I left, one of the men called after me. "Cut ice, Granny," he said, laughing. "Make yourself a lake." The words followed me like thrown snow. When I reached home near midday, Nate met me at the door, cheeks red from the stove heat. He had marked the patch record. 32 stitches held, he said, serious as a clerk. That small steadiness made my throat ache. I set the rope on the table. "Not for the well," I told him. "For hauling." Then I pulled the muslin strip from my coat. "We're making a cistern," I said. He blinked. "A what?" "A barrel to hold clean water inside," I said, "like a big jug that sits still." We had one empty barrel out back, used for salt pork before the salt ran out. I scrubbed it with hot water and ash, then rinsed it until my arms shook. I lined the inside with the clean cloth, folded double, tied under the hoops with twine. Nate held the lantern close so I could see the seams. Every 40 minutes, I made him rest. The air in the cabin was dry, and his cough came when he worked too hard. So I set a rule. And rules are a kind of shelter. By dusk, the barrel stood on stones near the stove, not close enough to scorch, near enough to keep from freezing. I wrote a stove repair note on a scrap. December, a 5, moved barrel 18 inches from iron, 1920. I pinned it to the shelf with a nail. Proof that I was not guessing. The next days became a pattern. Before dawn, I cut ice. At first light, I hauled it. Near midday, I melted it in measured batches. After dusk, I strained it again through cloth into the barrel. If the cloth looked gray, I boiled the water first, then cooled it with the lid set loose so steam could escape. Nate watched the barrel like it was a living thing. He began to speak to it softly, not foolish, just hopeful. "Stay," he would whisper. "Don't turn to stone." On December 7th, the wind shifted. It brought a wet edge that made snow cling heavy to the roof. By midday, the creek ice grew slick. My axe glanced once, and the blade bit my boot toe. It split the leather, not my foot. Still, It was a warning. That afternoon, I measured the snow again. The doorframe mark read 6 inches now. I wrote it beside another ledger line. December 7th. Snow 6 inches, wood 2 days, if wind holds. Then the first real cost came. The stove began to draw pour. Smoke pushed back into the room, thin at first, then thick. My eyes watered. Nate coughed harder, and I saw fear in his face for the first time. I opened the damper and felt with my hand near the flue. A seam had loosened where the pipe met the wall thimble. Soot streaked the plaster. A visible crack, black as a bruise. Out, I told Nate. Step outside for a breath. He wrapped in a shawl and went, eyes on me. I took the pipe apart with my screwdriver and a knife. I scraped the soot, reseated the joint, and sealed it with clay and ash paste. At 21:05, I wrote another note. Flue, joint reset, clay seal. At 21:05. Proof again. So I could trust the fix when night made me doubt. By the second week, my hands were raw. The axe handle rubbed blisters under old calluses. The cold split my knuckles. I began to count my own limits. If I lost grip, the work would stop. So I wrapped my hands in cloth strips and tied them like bandages. Nate tried to help more. He carried smaller pieces of ice. Around the room, he swept the floor, kept the lamp trimmed, watched the kettle. Quiet began to settle on him in a way I did not like. Thirst makes a child stingy with words. On December 11th, I opened the last tagged flour sack. H. Larkin Store stared up at me from the cloth. Inside was only a thin drift of powder. I shook it into the bowl and wrote, December 11th, flour dust, start cornmeal. Proof and grief in one line. That day, we ate mush, and I stirred it slow, and added a spoon of lard to keep it from feeling like punishment. Nate ate without complaint, but I saw him lick the spoon clean, like a man starved. The water barrel held, but it was never full. It sat half to 2/3, because melting took wood, and wood took strength. I began to keep a second jug in the root cellar under the floor trap. The cellar was no more than a dug pit lined with planks, used for potatoes and apples. Now it became our cold room, stable and quiet. That was our unusual shelter, not for bodies, but for the things that kept bodies alive. The root cellar held the jugs so they would not freeze when the fire went low at night. Nate would climb down with the lamp and check the lids like a little watchman. On December 14th, a neighbor rode by. His name was Porter, a man who had land and a loud voice. and he pulled up near our fence and looked at my woodpile. It was smaller than pride likes to show. "Webb," he called, "you runnin' out?" I kept splitting, the maul rising and falling. "I manage," I said. He spat into the snow. "You got no man," he said. "Bank don't like that." He nodded toward our cabin. "Sheriff's been talkin' liens." He smiled, and it was the same kind of smile Larkin wore. "What do you want?" I asked. "Rent," he said, though the land was mine by paper my son had paid for in sweat. "Or you sell me your claim cheap and go back east." His eyes slid to Nate. "Boy could be placed with folks who can feed him." My grip tightened on the maul. I felt my pulse in my wrists. Anger is heat, but it burns you if you hold it too long. "I have paper," I said. "Deed in a tin box." He laughed. "Paper don't warm a cabin," he said, and then he rode on, leaving hoof prints like stamps. That night, after dusk, I set the rifle across my knees while Nate slept, not to shoot, to remind myself I was still here. A week later, the sky turned heavy. The air went still. You can feel a storm before it arrives, the way a dog feels thunder. On December 20th, I woke before dawn to a sound like sand against glass. Snow was blowing, fine and hard, driven by a north wind. The world beyond the window was white without shape. I measured the snow at the doorframe. The old mark was buried. I carved a new one higher, 9 inches and rising. I wrote, December 20th, snow 9 inches by 05:30. Proof and warning. The blizzard came in full by midday. Wind shoved at the cabin like a shoulder. The chimney moaned. Drifts piled against the door, and the latch grew stiff. We could not reach the creek, while we could not cut ice. All we had was what sat in the barrel, and the jugs in the cellar. That is when the system I built was tested, not by cleverness, by weather that does not care. I rationed water, like medicine. A cup at breakfast, half cup at midday, a cup at supper if Nate's cough rose. I marked each serving on a strip of paper, tally marks like a jailer, because the mind lies when tired. Nate began to shiver even by the stove. His skin was dry. His eyes looked too big. Thirst was not only in the mouth, it was in the way he breathed. "I'm fine," he whispered once. That was how I knew he was not. After midnight, the stove went low. The firewood was damp from the storm air. Smoke curled. I woke and felt the cabin cold line creeping up my legs. I did not light the lamp. I saved kerosene. In the dark, and I groped the floor trap and lifted it. Cold rose from the root cellar like breath from a cave. Down there, The jug lids were stiff, but not frozen. The water inside was cold as creek stone, but it was water. I poured a cup for Nate, hands shaking, and climbed back up. By 2:10, I had him drinking slow, his small fingers wrapped around the cup. Then I sat with my back to the stove and fed it splinters, one at a time, like nursing a newborn. Before dawn, the wind eased. Not ended, just eased enough to hear the creek again, far off, under its lid. At first light, I tried the door. It would not open. Snow had packed tight against it, a wall. So I took the shovel and dug from inside, pushing snow into the room, then out the side window. It took an hour to make a gap big enough to squeeze through. The cold hit like a slap, and my eyelashes froze. I kept my face turned down and worked. Outside, the world was a drifted field. Fences were gone. Our woodpile was half buried. The well was a mound with a hole. I crawled to the well and cleared the rim. Inside was darkness and a thin sound of water deep below. The short rope I'd bought could not reach, but I had another thought now, born of need. I tied that rope to a long sapling pole, straight as I could find. I lashed the pole with cloth strips and knots that would not slip. On the end, I fixed a hook made from a bent nail and the old barrel hoop. It was crude. It was what I had. I lowered it slow, feeling for the bucket handle that had dropped. The well swallowed the pole, length after length. My arms ached. My breath steamed hard. At 9:15, after many tries, the hook caught something, and a gentle tug answered back. Not the feel of stone, the feel of metal. Hold, I told myself. Hold steady. I lifted. The pole bowed. The rope creaked. For a moment, I thought it would all go again. Then the bucket broke the darkness, rising into light, dripping. The handle was snapped on one side, the knot still clinging to the frayed hemp end. Proof again, like the world insisting on leaving evidence. I set the bucket down and laughed once, a sound that startled me. Nate stood at the doorway watching, snow on his hair, like flour. His face held both hope and fear, because a child knows joy can vanish. I did not trust the rope. Not yet. I did not lower it again. Instead, I carried the bucket to the cabin and poured it through the muslin into the barrel, slow, careful, watching for grit. The water smelled of earth. I boiled it and then cooled it near the stove. We drank a half cup each, and I felt the warmth of relief, a quiet kind. Still, winter was not finished. The well rope was still broken. The storm had eaten our woodpile. Town men's laughter still sat on my skin. 2 days later, I walked to Ash Hollow again. The road was rough, and the drifts hid holes. I reached the store near midday, cheeks stung raw. Mr. Larkin saw me and raised his brows. "Back already?" he said. "You must be drinkin' the creek." I set my trade chit on the counter. Beside it went the stove repair notes. Then I opened the ration ledger page where he could see the pencil lines and dates. "Here is my proof," I said. "Here is my work. I need a full well rope. A sound bucket as well. I will pay, but I will not be mocked." He looked at the papers like they offended him, and then he took them up, one by one. His mouth tightened. Maybe he saw that I was not guessing. Maybe he saw that if the boy died, talk would turn against him. "Sheriff's been speakin'," he said, lower now. "Porter says you owe." I met his eyes. "I owe no man my land," I said. "My son paid. Your bank man can read the deed, if he can read it all." A woman does not win often in a room built for men. Still, I had one thing. I had steadiness, and I had the visible truth of a frayed rope end in my pocket. He sold me the rope, not cheap, but he sold it. He also gave me a new bucket, and on the tag he wrote in ink, "Paid by labor, Webb." That tag was another proof detail, and I kept it. Outside, by the hitch rail, Porter stood with 2 other men. He watched me load the rope coil on my sled. His eyes were hard. "You think paper saves you," he said. I did not answer. I kept my hands moving. On the walk home, the sky cleared bright, cold sharpened. It was the kind of day that tricks you into thinking winter has mercy. At dusk, I fixed the new rope to the well beam. I tied the knot, slow, double, then triple, the way my mother taught me with clothesline. Nate held the lantern. His face was calm again, and that was a gift. "Write it," he said quietly. So I did. I opened the ledger and wrote, "December 24, new rope set, not triple, 18 to 10. Proof, and a kind of prayer." On Christmas morning, we did not have much. A biscuit each from the last flour dust, a spoon of syrup I'd saved. But we had water that did not cost wood to melt. We had a fire that held. We had a boy's cough that eased. Still, the pushback came in January, and the bank man rode out with the sheriff, collars up, faces pinched by cold. They stood on my stoop at midday, boots stamping. "Mrs. Webb," the bank man said, as if the title made him kind, "we have note of arrears. Porter claims you owe rent. Larkin claims you trade on credit." I held the door with one hand and the ledger with the other. No invitation passed my lips. Letting the cold speak for me, I stayed in the doorway. "Here is my record," I said. I showed the trade chit, the bucket tag, and the stove notes with their times. After that, I pointed to the snow marks on the frame, knife cuts with dates. Last, I lifted the patch record with Nate's stitches, counted and signed by my own initials. "These are my accounts," I said. "I have no husband to speak for me, so I speak for myself." The sheriff, a quieter man, looked at Nate, and Nate stood behind me, shoulders square, holding a cup of water like it was a flag. The sight did something. Men are not made of stone. Not all of them. The bank man cleared his throat. "We'll review," he said. That was not victory. But it was time. Sometimes time is all a woman needs. After they left, Nate sat at the table and traced the rope fibers from the old frayed end I'd kept. He held it like a relic. "Why keep it?" he asked. "So I remember what almost happened," I said. "And so I don't lie to myself when things get easy." February came with clear nights. The creek froze thick. Our well rope held. Still, I did not stop the barrel cistern. I kept it lined with clean cloth. I kept it as a second life, because winter teaches you not to trust one thing. By 3 o'clock on the coldest nights, I would rise, check the stove, and look at the water level. A habit becomes safety. A record becomes a kind of fence. When spring finally softened the drifts, folks in Ash Hollow spoke different. Not all of them, but some. A woman from downriver came to ask how I kept water from freezing. I showed her the barrel near the stove, the cloth lining, the way I boiled and cooled. Next came the root cellar jugs. Then I handed her my notes and times. "You wrote it down," she said, surprised. "I did," I answered, "because my mind forgets when tired. And because men believe paper more than a woman's word." She smiled then, small and tired, like me. She went home with a strip of muslin and a new idea. Nate grew steadier. His cheeks filled back. His cough became only a memory. He learned to tie knots without my hands guiding his, and that is how you see a child turning into a man, quietly. One evening, near dusk, he stood by the well and looked down into the dark. "It's deep," he said. "It is," I told him, "and it gives, if you treat it right, Like most things. He nodded, and he did not look afraid. I kept the frayed rope end in the tin box with the deed, not as a threat, as a reminder. Thirst had been in the house. We had been close to losing everything that mattered. Ice had been cut and melted with careful fire. A barrel cistern had been sunk and guarded like a promise. Then winter came, and it tested what we built. We lived through it, not because the cold spared us, because we measured, we mended, we recorded, and we did not waste what we could not replace. If you want more calm frontier stories like this, subscribe and come back again.